Hey DIYers, what's going on? Mike Borders with the Mike Borders channel. Thank you for watching. We're working on an outdrive Mercruiser, and this is a full rebuild of the lower unit. This is part 4. Let's continue the project. All right, DIYers, back at the workstation now, and again, this is part 4 of the lower unit rebuild. And basically right now, the lower unit is a hollow case, minus the pinion bearing that we installed in part 3. And on the left-hand side are the old parts. There's the new bearing carrier. And we've got several new parts, gears, bearings, seals, etc., as well as shafts. There's our drive shaft, and the propeller shaft is on our table full of new parts. What I'll do now is remove the lower unit and stand to give me more room, and I'll show you the new parts. I'm now in the process of organizing all the new parts, and here is the gear assembly. Well packaged, all the gears and bearings. All right, DIYers, at this point, I've got everything out of the gear assembly box here. And again, this is the OEM Quicksilver 43-878087 Alpha 4. And now I want to discuss the internal parts. We'll start with the reverse gear. And this portion is going to be inside the back portion of your bearing carrier. However, first, this new bearing has to be pressed onto the gear. And that's pretty cool looking. Check that out. And once that's pressed on, again, that will go inside the bearing carrier. And then over here, we have a large rubber O-ring, and that will be installed on this portion or beveled portion of the carrier. And once installed, this is what creates that oil-tight and watertight seal to keep the oil inside the engine and the water out. And real quick, I'll give you the part number on that. Right there. In addition, it comes with this little bearing here. And for us, we just bought a full brand new bearing carrier. And already installed are both the 2 oil seals and the internal bearing, which is this right here. Not sure if you can see it deep in there. I'll give you a closer view of it here shortly. I'll set that aside. This is the forward gear. And here's the race or carrier. And the old one is still installed in the lower unit. Here is the bearing. And this is already factory pressed on, which is awesome. I'll set that aside. And this is your pinion gear. In addition, here is our new bearing and carrier that is going to go onto our new shaft. This is the old shaft, but there is the new part for right here. Again, old shaft, old bearing, old carrier, everything will be brand new. Next, we have the clutch dog and the internal splines. And that's nice. Here is the clutch dog part number, again, OEM Quicksilver. Set that aside. And one part I forgot to mention, this is the thrust ring that will go on the back side of the bearing carrier when installing the gear. And finally, we have our shift shaft, which is that part right here. And here's the old part in relation. You've got your bushing, the bearing, and a couple washers here. And this will all be brand new. I'll set that aside. And here is the old shift crank, and here is the part number for the new shift crank. And there they are, old, new. And back to the old shift shaft and bushing. Here is the new bushing. It already comes with the oil seal pressed in there. And all of this, again, is going to be brand new. I'll set that aside. And up here, you have your pinion gear nut that secures to the lower portion of the drive shaft. And then you have a bunch of shims. And as I mentioned, there is the new drive shaft down there, and the propeller shaft is in that mix of boxes over there. And DIYers, the next couple steps require a factory press, which we don't have. So we talked to our local Marina, and we are going to take all of the old parts as well as new parts, and they have a service manual for our exact serial number engine, and they are going to put things together to ensure that they are properly installed to factory specifications. In other words, I'm taking the new gears and bearings and bearing carrier to the local Marina, and they're going to put everything back together, and they said it'd take about 2 days, which is great. Gears and bearings are boxed up, ready to go to the local Marina, and there again is the clutch dog. That's the new one. I want to show you the old propeller shaft and the old clutch dog, as well as the forward gear and bearing and the shifting mechanism. And again, all of this will be brand new. However, as promised, here is a close-up view of the internal bearing inside the bearing carrier. Pretty convenient already having that installed, as well as the 2 oil seals. And this new bearing carrier with everything installed was about $105. One last thing prior to going to the local marina and dropping off the parts, this is our old bearing carrier, and it still has the thrust ring and reverse gear installed in it. And again, in our project, we are not using the old gear. However, you may be using the old gear, and you will need to remove the gear, thrust ring, and O-ring from the carrier. So for your convenience, scrolling above right now is a link to a video, and we are going to show you how to remove the parts from the carrier. Definitely check that out. Back from the marina, and while we wait for those parts to be put together, we are going to install the new shift shaft, bushing, and internal crank. And first thing we want to do, come up top, and that is where the shift shaft and bushing will go into. There's the thread and the cavity. And it's a good idea to clean the internal thread and mating surface prior to installing that shift shaft bushing. New parts are organized on the workbench. Again, we have the shift crank, the shift shaft, a couple washers and O-rings, and the bushing. And the only thing I'm using from the old part is that small little clip at the very bottom, as you can see here. So I am going to take apart this bushing to gain access to that clip. Not much to this DIYers, you just carefully shift this up. And again, it has that internal rubber seal, and you'll just shift it off the spline area of the shaft. And you also have the lower washer here, and the O-ring is still connected to it. And in a groove that was machined in by the manufacturer is this clip. You just grab it and pull it right off. And there it is. From here, I'm just going to take all the old parts and get them out of here so I don't get anything unorganized. Everything is now unpackaged. I put on some clean new gloves. And again, here's the shift shaft, the shift crank, the bushing. This is the tool we're going to use to secure everything back in place in the lower unit. In addition, we've got that clip, O-ring, rubber seal, and 2 washers, and we are going to put this back together. First thing we're going to do is grab the clip and align it properly with the machine groove and apply some friendly pressure and install it. That is what it looks like. Next, the small washer, and we'll just slide that right down flush with the clip. And the next thing we need to do is install this rubber O-ring to the bottom portion of the bushing, and I'm going to grab some 2,4-C grease as shown here. And do not overdo this, just a little bit. As you can see, that's all I'm using. And I'll grab the bushing, and I'm basically going to lubricate that little gap in between the threaded portion and the mating surface of the bushing. And after I do this, I'm going to clean out the thread. And I'll wipe my hands clean, grab the O-ring, and carefully shift it onto the bushing all the way flush into its slot as shown here. From here, I'll grab a paper towel and I'll carefully clean out all the thread. I'll set that back down, I'll cap off the grease, set that aside, and from here I'm going to grab my Mercury gear lube SAE 90. This is the exact same gear lube you insert in the lower unit. And what I'm going to do with the cap on, obviously, tip it upside down, and then I'm going to unscrew it and just use the oil that is on the inner portion of the cap. And I'll dab it with a finger, and all I'm going to do is lubricate the inner oil seal inside the bushing. And that's it. You can't access it from the bottom, so that's all you need to do. Do not overdo it. Grab your shift shaft, carefully align this, and once the shift shaft meets the rubber seal, you'll have to apply some friendly pressure. Just like that, all the way flush, as shown here. Now it's time to install it in the lower unit. Before moving on, I want to show you a close-up view of the bushing and O-ring with the grease. Again, no need to overdo it. Next, what we'll do is install the shift shaft crank, and very important, one side has a spline machine groove and cutout, and the other side is completely round with no splines or gear connection feature. And we're going to come inside. Deep inside there, you'll see a little tab sticking up, and behind it to the left is a pin. That's actually your drain port pin or screw, and we're going to shift that crank in place and onto that little tab with the spline machine cut portion of the crank facing up or on top. Not really a good way to give you a view as I do this, but I'm going to carefully shift that crank onto the pin, and you want to ensure that the shift crank itself is facing left or that way as shown here. And I'll even push it. And that is how the manual wants you to align that prior to shifting that actual shift rad down through the cavity and into that spline portion on top of that crank. Taking a step back, and we are now going to install the shift shaft and bushing. And as you do this, just carefully shift the entire shaft inside the cavity. And you may need to go down below and use your other arm and hand to carefully shift the crank until you can properly align the splines on both the bottom portion of the shaft as well as the top portion of the crank. Coming to a different camera angle, I want to show you a top view, and you'll see some thread. We are not all the way in, as you can see there. We'll come down below and I'll scroll in, and as you can see, the bottom portion of the crank is still on the pin and the top portion of the crank is properly aligned and secured to the bottom portion of the shaft. Now it's time to secure the bushing. Next part is very important. Our service manual requires 50 pounds to be applied to that bushing as we screw it in tight to the case. I've got my torque wrench here, and as of right now it is zeroed out. I'm going to turn the handle clockwise until it rotates all the way up to 50. And there it is. As you can see, the top black portion of the handle is flush with the 50 line. The actual line goes to the left of the 5 and shifts downward at an angle and then shifts left to that solid long line that's vertical in between all the numbers. Back up top, grab your bushing tool, align the 2 bottom teeth with the 2 open slots on the top portion of the bushing. And from here, I'm just using a 3/4 socket and ratchet, and I'm going to screw this bushing in until I feel some tension. And once I feel the tension, I will shift over to the torque wrench. And there's the tension. And again to the torque wrench, 50 pounds. And I move the camera back to give me more room. And no need to rush this, be precise. And it's getting more and more tight. There it is. You hear that click? That indicates that this bushing is properly set to 50 pounds. Now to a close-up view of the Craftsman torque wrench that we used. Again, 50 pounds was set, as shown here. And let's go back up top. We're going to carefully pull off the bushing tool. Set that aside. Next, grab that rubber seal, and we are going to carefully position it over the spline portion of the top shaft and push this as far down into the bushing as we can until it's flush with the top oil seal. Last, the larger washer, as shown there. That is the finished product of the shift shaft and crank. And DORs, that is it. That is the end of part 4. Scrolling above right now is a link to part 5. We'll pick up right where we left off and continue the project. We still have a lot to do, but we're excited to continue and get it done. From here, again, we hope this helps. Do us a favor, below the video, you will see that thumbs up icon. Click on that, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Definitely ring your YouTube bell. That would be very helpful to us. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching.